In this particular gaming PC build, we are starting with these core components as shown, and then in span of like a couple of months I have added more hardware to make the gaming PC build complete. So I mainly build this PC in two stages. In the first stage, like it is shown in the image as well on the screen, it consists of all the core components. Whereas in second stage, I focused on the cooling aspect and added like ARGB fans for the case, some LED light strips, ARGB as well, a second RAM module to make RAM work in dual channel, and a beefy CPU cooler to keep the thermals in control. So let's start with the components first that I used, and let's first look at the case and power supply. So I got a combo of case and power supply. Actually, we went with the Corsair Carbide series spec 05 mid tower case. I chose this case as like it has a decent airflow and decent aesthetics, and I got this bundled with a Corsair CV650 like bronze certified 650 watt power supply, and that I felt like it was sufficient for my PC specs for now. I also got a red LED Corsair fan with it in the case. So in the box we get the case, instruction manual, warranty information, and an Allen key to open the acrylic side panel screws. So after we open the acrylic side panel, we can see that the power supply and the case fan are already installed in the case. In the back, we can see we have a good amount of space for routing cables and for our cable management. So this case supports three 120 millimeter or two 140 millimeter fans in the front, two 120 millimeter fans at the top, and one 120 millimeter fan at the rear. So inside the hard drive tray we can find a box containing all the relevant screws and the important hardware needed for the build, which is provided by the case manufacturer, and we also find some cable ties for the cable management. For CPU, I went with the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is a mid-range CPU but with an excellent performance, and since I will be using this PC mainly for gaming and some video editing, this CPU I think will be more than sufficient for the performance that I require. So this processor has a total of 6 cores, 12 threads, operating at 3.7 GHz base, and which can boost up to 4.6 4.7 GHz depending upon the load and thermals. So since this is an X variant, it is also overclockable. For boot SSD, I went with the P1 500 GB like NVMe M.2 SSD. I already have like one 500 GB old hard drive with me, which I will be upgrading to a much bigger SSD for the bulk storage in the future. Like storage is something that you can go on increasing as the time goes on, and it's very easy to add storage. So I'll be starting with this P1 500 GB NVMe SSD and a 500 gig 7200 RPM hard drive that I had lying around. For RAM, I chose like Corsair Vengeance LPX 8 GB stick operating at a speed of 3200 megahertz, CL16 with CL16 latency. I basically started with one stick, and then as I told in the second phase, I just added one more stick to operate it in dual channel. That makes a total of 16 gigs. So I think that is sufficient for my purposes. So for motherboard, I went with the MSI MPG B550 Gaming Plus motherboard. Before starting the build, I had to update the BIOS since like this motherboard doesn't support 5000 series Ryzen CPUs out of the box, and I already made a video on this topic, so you can check out that video. It will be somewhere on the screen. So basically this motherboard comes with some good features like support for overclocking, decent VRM cooling, flash BIOS through USB function, Mystic like software to control your RGB lights. And for nVMe we get one M.2 slot which is on Gen 4 and one slot which is on Gen 3. For PCI Express devices we have two 16x slots, one Gen 4 and one Gen 3, and we also get two 4x PCI Express slots. For the graphics card I went with ASUS GeForce RTX 2060 OC Evo 6 GB. Since like I currently have no option everywhere in the world, we see scalper prices on the graphics card. Down the line I'll upgrade my GPU if needed. So this GPU comes with new RTX graphics and NVENC encode technology that will help in gameplay recording and streaming. This GPU will also be helpful in light video editing applications that I intend to use with my rig. So this GPU has one display port, two HDMI ports and one DVI port for the output. So these are the core components. For stage 2, as I said, we focused on cooling. So for case cooling and like some RGB aesthetic, I went with Antec Prizm set of 3 ARGB fans, 2 ARGB strips and one command module. So it comes as a set. Since like I had more room in my case, I also purchased one more Antec Prizm ARGB fan separate along with this. So I chose this since it was a good value, and also like fans had RGB rings on both sides, so the look is really nice when you see from outside as well as from inside. And also it was compatible with MSI Mystic Light software, so I can easily use my Mystic Light software to sync all my fans RGB. So that was one of the reason. For CPU cooler, basically I used my PC 1 to 2 months with the included AMD stock CPU cooler, but during like gaming and video exports it was reaching around 80 to 82 degrees with the AMD stealth cooler. So basically I like decided to upgrade my CPU cooler with the Noctua NHU12S Chromax Black. So this cooler comes with like both mounting options for Intel as well as AMD CPUs, and also it comes with a Noctua thermal paste and a fan splitter to reduce the noise more on the fan. These were the core components that we used in both the stages. Now let's get started with the build process for the PC. So before you start any PC build, please make sure you are working in a static free workspace, and if possible please use like anti-static wristband if it is available to you, or keep grounding yourself regularly so that you don't break something due to static charges. For the build process, you will need some basic tools like Phillips head screwdriver and a magnetic parts tray. Since I didn't have that, I used a small steel container that I had in my home to hold the screws. Let's start by taking out the motherboard from the anti-static bag and place it on the motherboard box. Also like keep the motherboard and case manual handy so that you can refer to them when needed. Now let's open the CPU box and carefully take out the CPU. Please be cautious while handling the Ryzen CPU since a bent pin can lead to CPU dying, so just be careful with that. So take out the CPU and the included cooler from the box. On the motherboard, open the retention arm and try to align the golden triangle on the CPU with the triangle on the CPU socket. Once you put the CPU above the socket, just gently drop the CPU into the place, and it will automatically get seated. You don't have to apply force or anything to push it, so don't try to push it onto the socket. Once it is seated, just close the retention arm and then you can move to the next step. So after installing the CPU, first let's install our nVMe M.2 SSD. Just below the CPU on my motherboard, like you have the M.2 slot, so just open the screws on the SSD cooler and remove it. After removing it, make sure that SSD fits into the standoff which is already in place, and there are no standoffs in between, like below the SSD once you mount it. Insert the SSD into the slot at a 45 degree angle, and since it only keys in one way, you don't need to worry about misconfiguring it in the slot. Once inserted, take the included M.2 screw and screw down the SSD properly by gently pushing it down. And once you're done with that, you can place the heatsink top back on the SSD, but make sure that you remove the plastic cover inside, which is covering the thermal pad basically for the cooling, and then you can screw back the SSD heatsink. After that, now let's install the RAM. So basically it's the second slot from the CPU usually, but you can refer to your motherboard manual for that. So it basically tells you which is the best slot for the RAM to put in. So pull the retention tab out and line up the RAM notch with the RAM socket and place it inside the slot. Then try to push gently from the top till you hear a click sound. After that, let's install the AMD Stealth CPU cooler. First, remove the already existing mechanism by removing the 4 screws around the CPU socket. Since the CPU cooler comes with a thermal paste pre-applied, we don't need to put any additional thermal paste here. Now align the CPU cooler over the CPU with the 4 holes from where you remove the existing CPU cooler mechanism. Once aligned, try to tighten the screws in a cross pattern. Make sure to not put too much pressure on the cooler. Also make sure while you are tightening the screws, don't tighten it all the way, like don't tighten first screw all the way. Screw in turn by turn in a cross fashion to have like an optimal installation. Then like you need to screw in till the screws are tight enough and they don't screw in anymore, since it already has a spring mechanism, so it will lock in and it will not over screw. So once you have screwed in the CPU cooler, you can connect the CPU fan, and there is a pin header marked as CPU fan on the motherboard, so you can insert the CPU fan lead over there. Now let's take out the case, open both the side panels, and we'll keep it in a safe place so that the acrylic side panel doesn't get scratched, even like the metal one doesn't get scratched and its paint job gets screwed. Since all the standouts for the motherboard are already screwed in the case, we can now move ahead directly installing the motherboard into the case. In our motherboard we don't have a separate IO shield, but if you have, you should install that first. So we can now lower down the motherboard in an angle and then push it towards the back panel. Notice here I am handling the motherboard by the CPU cooler, so make sure you are touching the motherboard where there aren't any sensitive components. So once the motherboard is lowered properly, you can go ahead and screw in all the motherboard screws into the pre-installed standoffs. Make sure to use the correct screws for installing the components. You can refer to the case manual to get more detail about the screws, type of screws, like which screw to use where. Once all the screws are in place, let's route the 24 pin connector from the power supply through the back and from the side of the motherboard, and we will also plug it in. Make sure to press the connector firmly while pushing the cable into the socket. In the same way, we'll take the CPU 8-pin connector and route it through the back and through the side into the CPU 8-pin socket. Once these two are installed, we will take the front panel connectors like the power reset switch, front USB header, HD audio cables, and then connect them in a proper place on the motherboard. You can refer the motherboard manual to get more details about where to plug in the front panel connectors properly. So once this is done, now let's do some cable management at the back before we proceed to add GPU and hard disk drive. So I use the included zip ties and some of my own cable ties to cleanly route the cables at the back and secure them properly so that we don't get an ugly bulge at the back and our side panel is not closing. So during this step, I also routed a PCI Express power cable through the side for the GPU. So when I install the GPU, I can use that particular cable for the power. And I also routed the proper SATA power cables towards the hard drive cage where we will install the hard disk. So I left out only one set of cable for now and tucked away the rest of them for future use, since we'll only be installing one SATA drive as of now. Then for my hard drive, I routed the SATA data cable from the motherboard till the hard drive cage from the back, and then I connected my secured hard drive in one of the hard drive cage and installed the cables behind the hard drive. So once that is done, now it's time for opening up the graphics card, which is the most expensive part of the build. So let's open the package and remove all the packing material and plastic covering the GPU. Remove the back brackets that align with the GPU slot, and then in the most top one, like PCI Express 16X slot, we'll first unlock the retention tab and click it downwards, and then we'll take the GPU, and it seems that we have some protection film here on the back plate as well on the front, so we'll remove it. Please remove the protective cover from the GPU pins as well, and then align the GPU with the slot and try to push gently till you hear a click sound. Now put back the retention screws at the back so that GPU is firmly fixed in like its place, and take the PCI power cable and plug it into the GPU power socket. Once all of this is done, let's try to connect a monitor and a keyboard and mouse to the PC, and we'll try to run it for the first time and see if it posts. So as you can see here in the screenshot, the PC posts, and we can see our Ryzen 5 5600X processor, 8 gigs of RAM. We'll press F1 to go into the BIOS and configure XMP for our RAM to make it run at 3200 megahertz for the best performance. Now in stage 2, for optimal airflow inside the case and RGB lighting, of course, I added the case fans from Antec, and I also added the second stick of RAM to make the PC run in dual channel mode. Like after this, I used my PC for some time and I noticed that the CPU is running very hot and it was reaching 82 degrees when I try to run demanding games or do kind of video rendering on it. So I got the Noctua NHU12S CPU cooler and installed it, and now the temps are well within range, and like here is the look of the final PC build. So enjoy.